The World Bank loans almost $100 million to a group in Brazil, the country's largest exporter of beef, and cutting down rainforests to create pasture lands for beef is one of the biggest sources of deforestation, therefore carbon emissions. The World Bank's own internal watchdog group concluded the project was a risk from the environment, yet it went ahead. And maybe, are you familiar with that project?
It's a routine project.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, this is where we are always making judgments. What's the without the bank scenario? So in this case, this was an IFC project, a private sector project. I think the IFC felt if we're in this project, we can help make this company more sustainable, make sure that there's actually sustainable livestock practices in the country. There were a series of agreements, of standards that the company was going to have to meet. And in the event, that didn't happen, and so the IFC actually canceled that project recently.
And the interesting footnote is that Greenpeace issued a report about deforestation in the Amazon and the impact of cattle grazing on deforestation, a contributor to deforestation. And within a month, Nike announced that they were going to require all of their leather suppliers to certify that the company selling leather to Nike, that it doesn't come from deforesting the Amazon, which I thought was a pretty interesting example of an NGO applying some pressure and a corporation saying, look, we don't want to touch this because of our brand risk. So Awais, we've talked about technology. What other roles can corporations play as advocates and really connecting their brand to some of these climate change issues?
Well, I think corporations have a huge stake in not only from their internal practices, like Kathy talked about earlier, but in terms of their brands as they go into markets that they're not familiar with. You mentioned Nike. Nike, used to buy at one point 10, 15 years ago a lot of the things from parts of the world where labor laws were not standard, right? And then we saw 10, 15 years later, Nike pulled back from all of those practices too. And I think we're sort of seeing the same transition. And I think people in general in the world are getting conscious about the environmental impact for the things that they're buying, not just here in the West Coast, but I would actually say in the world in general. So I think corporations are actually playing a very active role. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think that they have a major stake in fighting climate change.
Let's stay on coal for a minute because we do have questions from the audience. We're discussing the World Bank and climate change at the Commonwealth Club. Question from the audience is the World Bank involved in carbon capture and sequestration? Can you talk about that? And let's, is that real? And is that something you're investing in?
Well, first of all, we're not investing in it at this point because it's very expensive, and most of the countries would not be prepared to borrow for it. So they would be looking for some type of exchange with the developing world. We are partnering with a variety of institutions, and of note, there's a new institution in Australia, which is a knowledge-based institution that's trying to bring together those countries that are trying to move this agenda forward, and trying to see how we can link up some of our own programs through the Clean Technology Fund, which we manage, and others, to get countries ready to be able to invest in carbon capture and storage. If a country wanted to borrow from us, we'd be delighted to it, but frankly, it's so expensive at this point, it would really require a heavy dose of grant-based finance, which we don't have available.
How about cleaning existing or projected new coal-fired power plants?
We have a few things. First, as part of our new strategy on climate change and development, we've set the bar pretty high in terms of what do we need to see in terms of new generation or new activities. We would want to be able to assure ourselves and assure the country that there really is a compelling development need. Major power shortages, something that says, there is a reason for action. Second, that there has been a really strong and technical analysis, financial analysis, economic analysis of alternatives. Is there a hydro solution? Is there another renewable solution? Can you actually meet this through energy efficiency rather than building new capacity?
Kathy, you mentioned hydro before, and let's talk about hydro. The bank pulled back from hydro after some bad experiences, and it sounds like hydro's back, or it may be back soon in a new fashion.
We had traditionally had hydropower as a very important part of our portfolio until the late 80s, early 90s, when we had some projects which frankly didn't meet their objectives in terms of the social and environmental sustainability. So we pulled back from those projects and said, we needed a bit of a cooling off period. We also
you didn't do the Three Gorges Dam, if I recall.
No, we never did the Three Gorges Dam, but these were other projects. And so we had a fairly lengthy period of time where major dam projects, we still had some small facilities, run-of-the-river facilities and the like in our portfolio, but we basically pulled away. Now, we felt that that was a good thing in terms of it was time for us to pause, to reflect on what had gone well and what had not gone on so well, but it was also doing a disservice to countries which needed to rely on hydropower. And so we said it's really time for us to get back in, but get back in a new way, get back in with a more progressive attitude towards getting benefits to people, building environmental values from the outset into the projects. We had the first major project was one called Nam Tum, which in Laos PDR, which is under implementation right now. And so far, we believe that it is achieving both of its development goals, but also being done in an environmentally and socially sustainable way. The Africa continent is likely to come to us for a variety of hydropower projects. We think that we can attend to these in a responsible way, so I think you will be seeing more of that in our portfolio going forward.
Large scale?
Both large and small. We clearly have different needs, and we are attracted to both, and we're attracted to the small scale run-of-the-river. Many places that is the appropriate solution. If it's going to be a large-scale program, we're trying to do a few things in different ways. Make sure that there's major improvement in the environmental footprint through offset reserves. That's what we did in Lao PDR. And also on the social side, where often things are more difficult, a mistake that had been made in the past is the local people didn't get access to power. It was all shipped out to the cities. Now there's a very strong concerted effort to make sure there's benefit sharing from the outset, so that both some of the job creation, the local benefits to communities are there, and as a priority, that local community is getting power.
I'm glad somebody asked building materials or the built environment, because if you look at the numbers, I mean, we hear a lot of talk about the emissions, and 8 to 9% or somewhere about 10% comes from the transportation sector. But it's almost about 40 to 42% is the number that comes from the built environment, and that includes the materials and that includes the operations. So when I'm talking about materials, it includes drywall, it includes anything that basically goes in putting a building up. And we're not going to have a significant impact on climate change unless we address the built environment. Just an example, the process of making drywall hasn't changed since 1917. I mean, that's like a 100-year-old process, which is extremely energy intensive. And there are companies here now which have come up with the new ways of making building materials. I mean, cement itself is about 8% of the worldwide carbon emissions. That's a huge number. So I think that in order to address the global emissions problem, the built environment has to be of strategic importance. And it's very surprising to see that we don't really hear Middle East actually doing a lot of things on the greener side, but places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, where most of the construction besides China is happening for the next 10, 15 years or so. The world's first green city is actually going to be in Abu Dhabi.
Masdar? Or?
The Masdar. Mm-hmm. And they are partnering with companies here in this valley and the West, which can enable the green built environment. So there's a lot of activity in the green building space, and I think it's very crucial to the entire emissions problem.